Pennsylvania's coal country, autumn of 1873, where hunger made honest people into gamblers and desperation wore a Sunday dress. In the valley town of Grafton, a woman with nothing left but her name stood before a crowd and agreed to marry a stranger for the promise of bread. They said the man was crippled, broken from the war, bound to a chair for the rest of his days. But sometimes what the world calls broken is only waiting for the right witness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The church hall smelled of wet wool and old hymnals. Rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the streets of Grafton into rivers of mud that swallowed wagon wheels and made every step an argument with the earth. Inside, the stove burned low, barely enough to take the edge off the October cold. Benches lined the walls, filled with families who had come to collect their rations from the relief committee: flour, lard, salt pork, if there was any left. The war had ended 8 years ago, but its ghosts still haunted these hills. Clara Whitmore sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, spine straight despite the weariness pressing down on her shoulders. Her dress was grey wool, mended at the elbows and collar, clean but thin. She was 31 years old. In Grafton, that made her a spinster. In her father's house, it had made her a burden. Now that her father was dead and the house sold to pay his debts, it made her invisible. She'd been staying in the church's charity room for 2 weeks, sleeping on a straw mattress alongside 3 other women who'd fallen through society's cracks. The pastor's wife allowed it because Clara helped with the washing and mending, but charity had limits. This morning, Mrs. Hadley had pulled her aside and said, quiet but firm, that she'd need to find other arrangements by week's end. There were families with children who needed the space more. Clara understood. She didn't argue. She simply nodded and returned to folding linens, trying not to think about where she'd go when the week ran out. The relief committee sat behind a long table at the front of the hall, 3 men in dark suits, faces lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from making impossible decisions. They called names from a ledger, handed out parcels wrapped in brown paper, marked entries with blunt pencils. The line moved slowly. Children fidgeted. Women whispered. Men stared at the floor. Clara didn't expect her name to be called. She wasn't on the list. She had no family, no husband, no claim to the county's limited mercy. She had come only because there was nowhere else to sit, no other place that would let her stay dry while she figured out what to do next. Then the door opened. A man entered, pushing himself forward in a wooden wheelchair, its wheels creaking with every rotation. He was broad across the shoulders, his arms thick with muscle, earned from years of hauling his own weight. His face was weathered, clean-shaven, with deep lines around his eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the valley itself. He wore a union coat, faded blue and patched at the seams, and his boots, though he had no need for them, were polished to a dull shine. The room didn't go silent, but the noise softened. People glanced, then looked away, some out of respect, some out of pity, some because they didn't know what else to do with a man who'd given his legs to the war and come home to a town that had no work for someone who couldn't stand in the mines or the mills. His name was James Brennan. Clara had seen him before, rolling through town on errands, picking up supplies, speaking to no one unless spoken to first. He lived alone in a cabin up on the ridge, built by his father before the war. People said he managed well enough. People also said he'd die alone up there, forgotten. James wheeled himself to the front of the hall and stopped near the committee table. He didn't ask for rations. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, loud enough to carry, "I'm looking for a wife." The room stilled. One of the committee men, a banker named Coulter, frowned and set down his pencil. "This isn't the place for jokes, Brennan." "I'm not joking." James's voice was steady, no trace of shame or hesitation. "I need someone to help run the house. Cook, mend, manage things I can't do from this chair. In return, I'll provide food, shelter, and a legal marriage." "She'll want for nothing." Coulter exchanged glances with the other men. One of them, a mill foreman named Pritchard, leaned forward. "You're serious?" As the grave. "And what woman in her right mind would agree to that?" Pritchard's tone wasn't cruel, just blunt. "You're asking someone to tie herself to a man who can't work, can't provide the way a husband should." James didn't flinch. "I'm asking someone who has nothing to consider something. I've got a roof that doesn't leak, a cellar stocked for winter, and land that's paid for. I'm not offering romance. I'm offering survival." A murmur rippled through the room. Some women looked away, embarrassed for him. Others whispered to their neighbors. But a few, those who knew what it meant to be out of options, listened. Clara listened. Coulter rubbed his temples. "We're not a matchmaking service, Brennan. If you want a wife, put a notice in the paper. I did, 3 months ago." No replies. James's gaze swept the room, not pleading, just factual. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering a trade. If there's a woman here who needs what I have, I'm willing to make it legal before a minister today." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Clara could hear the rain drumming on the roof, the hiss of the stove, the creak of a bench as someone shifted their weight. Her hands tightened in her lap. Her heart beat faster, not with hope, but with the cold arithmetic of survival. She had 4 days. No money, no family, no prospects. Winter was coming, and in these mountains, winter didn't ask permission. She stood. The scrape of her boots on the floorboards drew every eye. She walked forward, slow and deliberate, past the rows of benches, past the stares and the whispers, until she stood in front of James Brennan. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. "I'll do it," she said. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" "I do. You'll be bound to me, legally, for better or worse." "I understand. What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore." He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the sharp cheekbones, the tired eyes, the way she held herself like a woman who'd learned not to ask for kindness. Then he nodded. "James Brennan." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Whitmore." Coulter stood abruptly. "Now hold on. Is there a law against it?" James asked. "No, but is she of sound mind?" "I am," Clara said, her voice steady. "Then we'll need a minister." James looked past Coulter to the hallway leading to the pastor's office. "Reverend Cole's here, isn't he?" Pritchard sighed and rose from his chair. "I'll get him." 15 minutes later, Clara Whitmore stood beside James Brennan in the small office at the back of the church. Reverend Cole, a rail-thin man with kind eyes and a weary soul, opened his Bible and asked if they were certain. Clara said yes. James said yes. The Reverend married them with 5 sentences and a prayer. There were no rings, no flowers, no witnesses except Coulter and Pritchard, who signed the register with obvious reluctance. When it was done, the Reverend closed the Bible and said, "May God grant you both the strength to honor this covenant." Clara didn't feel married. She felt like she'd signed a contract. But contracts, at least, were clear. She knew what she was getting: food, shelter, survival. She knew what she was giving: labor, companionship, a name on a ledger. James wheeled himself toward the door. "We'll leave now. My wagon's outside." Clara followed him through the hall, past the families still waiting for rations, past Mrs. Hadley's shocked face, past the rain-streaked windows. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the kind that warned of snow to come. A small wagon sat near the side of the building, hitched to a sturdy roan mare. The bed of the wagon was lined with oilcloth to keep the rain off a pile of supplies: sacks of grain, crates of vegetables, a barrel of apples. James maneuvered himself to the side of the wagon, gripped the edge, and with practiced efficiency, hauled himself up onto the bench. He moved with strength, not grace, but there was no hesitation. Clara climbed up beside him. He handed her a wool blanket without a word. She draped it over her lap. The wagon rolled forward, wheels cutting through the mud. Grafton fell away behind them, swallowed by mist and trees. The road climbed steadily, winding through dense forest, where the branches hung low and the air smelled of moss and wet bark. They didn't speak. The rain softened to a drizzle, then stopped altogether, leaving only the sound of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon. Clara studied him from the corner of her eye. His hands on the reins were steady, his posture upright despite the chair strapped in the wagon bed behind them. He didn't look like a man who needed pity. He looked like a man who had learned to live within his limits and refused to apologize for them. After an hour, the trees opened into a clearing. A cabin stood at its center, built from dark timber with a stone chimney rising from one end. It was larger than she'd expected, well maintained, with a covered porch and shutters that fit snugly against the windows. A small barn sat to the left, and beyond it a garden plot already turned for winter. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. James brought the wagon to a stop near the porch. "This is it." Clara climbed down, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She looked around, taking in the split-rail fence, the woodpile stacked neatly under an awning, the chicken coop behind the barn. It was isolated, yes, but it wasn't desperate. It was a place someone had built with intention. James lowered himself into his chair, rolled to the back of the wagon, and began unloading supplies. Clara moved to help without asking, lifting a sack of flour and carrying it toward the cabin. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. This was the agreement. Inside, the cabin was warm. A fire burned low in the hearth. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A second door led to what looked like a smaller room, likely storage. Everything was clean, orderly, deliberate. James wheeled in behind her, setting a crate of potatoes near the door. "You'll sleep in the back room. I'll take the main. There's a basin for washing, linens in the chest. Supper's at 6. Breakfast at dawn. If you need something, ask." Clara nodded. She walked to the back room and found it small but sufficient. A cot, a trunk, a single window overlooking the forest. She set her bundle of belongings on the cot and returned to the main room. James was at the stove, building up the fire. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You don't have to be afraid of me. I'm not." "Good." He adjusted a log with an iron poker. "We're strangers. That won't change overnight. But we're bound now, and I keep my word. You'll be fed. You'll be safe. No one will touch you." Clara stood near the table, her hands resting on the back of a chair. "And what do you expect from me?" "Honesty, work, nothing you can't give." He finally looked at her, his gaze direct but not unkind. "I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. I'm asking you to survive the winter. We'll figure out the rest as we go." She met his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected, respect. Not for who she was, but for the fact that she'd chosen this, that she'd walked forward when no one else would. "All right," she said. He nodded once, then turned back to the fire. And so, in a cabin at the edge of the Pennsylvania wilderness, 2 people who had nothing but their word began the slow, uncertain work of building something from the ruins of what they'd lost. The first morning came cold and grey. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of metal striking metal, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from somewhere outside. She rose from the cot, pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, and stepped into the main room. The fire had been rebuilt, warmth already spreading through the space. James was gone. She moved to the window and looked out. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see him near the woodpile, axe in hand, splitting logs. He'd positioned his chair beside a low stump that served as a chopping block. The axe came down clean and sure, splitting each piece in one stroke. He worked with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve energy, to make every movement count. Clara watched for several minutes, understanding slowly settling over her. He didn't need help. He needed a partner. There was a difference. She turned from the window and surveyed the kitchen area. A pot of oatmeal sat on the stove, still warm. Beside it, a bowl and spoon had been set out on the table. No note, no instruction. Just breakfast, prepared and waiting. She ate standing up, looking around the room with fresh eyes. Everything had its place. The tools hung on pegs according to size. The firewood was stacked in ascending order of thickness. The dishes lived on a low shelf within easy reach from a seated position. This wasn't a home adapted for limitation. It was a home designed for capability. When James returned, rolling through the door with an armload of split wood balanced across his lap, Clara had already washed her bowl and begun sorting through the pantry, taking inventory of what they had. He deposited the wood in the box beside the hearth without speaking, then wheeled to the basin to wash his hands. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "There's enough flour for 3 weeks if we're careful," Clara said, not turning around. "Cornmeal for longer. The dried beans need sorting, some have weevils. I'll get fresh from town next month. The apples in the barrel are starting to turn. We should make preserves before they go bad." James dried his hands on a cloth and looked at her. "You know how?" "I do." "Then that's your call to make." She glanced over her shoulder. He wasn't dismissing her. He was trusting her. She nodded and returned to her inventory. The days developed a rhythm, unspoken but understood. James rose first, built the fire, brought in wood, and tended to the horse and chickens. Clara managed the kitchen, the washing, the mending, and the 100 small tasks that kept a household running. They moved around each other like dancers learning a new pattern, careful not to collide, but beginning to anticipate each other's movements. He never asked her to help him into his chair or out of it. He never apologized for what he couldn't do. When he needed something from a high shelf, he used a long wooden pole with a hook on the end. When he needed to reach something across the room, he kept a walking stick within arm's reach to drag it closer. He'd built his life around solutions, not complaints. Clara found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The way he sharpened tools with steady, patient strokes. The way he read by the fire in the evenings, lips moving slightly as he worked through dense passages of history or agriculture. The way he spoke to the horse, low, respectful, like she was a colleague rather than property. One afternoon, she was hanging laundry on the line, strung between 2 posts near the cabin, when she heard a crash from the barn. She dropped the sheet she'd been pinning and ran. Inside, she found James on the ground beside his overturned chair, a broken harness strap in his hands. He wasn't hurt, just stuck, lying on his side in the straw. Clara moved forward instinctively, reaching for his arm. "Don't!" She froze. James braced one hand against the stall door, the other against a support beam, and hauled himself upright. Then, with practiced movements, he righted his chair, positioned it, and lifted himself back into it. The whole process took less than a minute. When he was settled, he looked at her. "I fall sometimes. It happens. I don't need rescue. I need time." Clara's hands were still half extended. She lowered them slowly. "I wasn't trying to... I know." His voice wasn't harsh, just firm. "But if you start picking me up every time I go down, I'll start expecting it. And I can't afford that," she understood. Independence wasn't pride, it was survival. "What about the harness?" "Rotted through. I'll need to replace it before the leather gives out completely." He wheeled past her toward the cabin. "There's a tanner in Grafton. I'll go next week. I could go." He stopped and turned slightly. "You want to go back to town?" "I want to be useful." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "You are useful. But if you're offering, I won't say no. The trip's easier with 2. That evening after supper, James pulled out a slate and chalk and began making a list of supplies. Clara sat across from him, darning socks by lamplight. The fire popped softly. Outside, wind moved through the trees. "You never said what happened to your family," James said, his voice quiet. Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. "My father died last spring." Heart gave out. "My mother passed when I was 12. There was no one else." "No siblings?" "A brother. Died at Antietam," James nodded slowly. "Mine too. Gettysburg." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who understood that some losses didn't need elaboration. "Why didn't you marry before?" Clara asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. James set down the chalk. "I did, before the war. Her name was Rebecca. She died of cholera the winter I came home. By the time I got back from the hospital, she'd been in the ground 2 months. Clara's hands stilled completely. "I'm sorry." "So am I." He picked up the slate again, studying the list. "But sorrow doesn't keep a house warm." "No," Clara agreed softly. It doesn't. The following day, Clara began the work of preserving the apples. She peeled and cored them at the table while James worked nearby, oiling the hinges on the shutters. They didn't talk much, but the silence felt less like avoidance and more like companionship. She found herself humming an old hymn her mother used to sing, and didn't realize she was doing it until James glanced over. "You have a nice voice." She stopped, embarrassed. "It's nothing. It's something." He returned to his work. "This place has been quiet too long." By midday, the apples were simmering on the stove, filling the cabin with the sweet smell of cinnamon and clove. Clara stood over the pot, stirring, while James sat at the table, repairing a broken bridle. She glanced at him, then at the pot, then back again. "Are you hungry?" "I can wait for supper. There's bread from yesterday. And butter." He set down the leather strap and looked at her. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering normalcy. "All right." She cut 2 thick slices of bread, spread them with butter, and set one in front of him. Then she sat down across from him with her own. They ate without ceremony, the kind of simple shared meal that meant nothing and everything at once. "You're a good cook," James said after a moment. "You're a good carpenter. My father taught me. Said a man who can't build his own house doesn't deserve to live in one. My mother said a woman who can't feed herself will starve waiting for someone else to care." James smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. "Sounds like they would have gotten along." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of ease. That night she lay in her cot and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling, the creak of James moving in the other room, the pop of the fire dying down, the wind testing the shutters. For the first time since her father died, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She didn't know what it would bring, but she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The next morning, James was at the table when she emerged, 2 cups of coffee already poured. He slid one toward her without a word. She sat down and wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth. "I need to check the traps up on the ridge," he said. "There's a path wide enough for the chair if the ground isn't too soft. You're welcome to come if you want. Or stay, your choice," Clara considered. She could stay and finish the mending. She could stay and be safe and small and invisible. Or she could choose something different. "I'll come." They set out an hour later, James leading the way on a packed dirt trail that wound upward through the forest. Clara walked beside him, matching his pace, learning the rhythm of travel with someone who moved differently, but no less purposefully. The woods were quiet except for birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The traps were empty, except for one, a rabbit, clean catch, already still. James reset the trap with quick, practiced hands, while Clara held the rabbit, feeling its weight, its warmth fading. She'd cleaned the game before. This was no different, but something about the simplicity of it, the hunt, the catch, the provision, felt honest in a way town life never had. On the way back, James pointed out landmarks. The lightning split oak that marked the property line, the spring where they could get fresh water if the well ran low, the old stone foundation where his grandfather's cabin had stood before fire took it. "This land's been in my family since 1803, he said. "My great-grandfather bought it from a Lenape man who was leaving. Paid in silver and seeds. Fair trade, or as fair as anything was back then." Clara looked around at the forest, the hills rolling into the distance. "It's beautiful. It's mine," James said simply. "And now it's yours too." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she carried the words with her all the way back. That evening, Clara roasted the rabbit with herbs and potatoes. The meal was simple but satisfying, the kind that filled the belly and quieted the mind. After they ate, James pulled out a wooden board and a bag of carved pieces, a chess set well worn. "Do you play?" "My father taught me." "Good, I need practice." They played by firelight, the game slow and thoughtful. Clara won the first match. James won the second. The third ended in stalemate, both of them laughing softly at the absurdity of it. When Clara finally rose to go to bed, she paused at the door to the back room. "Thank you." James looked up from putting the pieces away. "For what?" "For keeping your word." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll keep it tomorrow too." She nodded and closed the door behind her. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became less a shelter and more a home. Clara learned where James kept the tools, how he liked his coffee, which corners of the property got sun and which stayed shaded. James learned that Clara sang when she worked, that she read poetry when she thought no one was watching, that she had a laugh, rare but real, that sounded like water over stones. They worked side by side, spoke when speech was needed, and let silence sit comfortably between them when it wasn't. And slowly, carefully, like frost melting in early spring, Clara began to believe that perhaps she had not just survived, perhaps she had found something worth staying for. November came with frost that painted the windows silver and turned the ground hard as iron. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, light and dry, dusting the pines like powdered sugar. Clara stood at the window, watching it accumulate on the porch rail, remembering other winters in other houses where cold meant danger, where every flake was a threat to survival. Here, the cabin stayed warm. The pantry stayed full. The wood stayed stacked. James was at the table behind her, writing in a ledger, tracking expenses, planning spring planting, the practical work of managing a life that refused to stop just because the world had tried to break him. She'd grown accustomed to the sound of his pencils scratching against paper, the occasional pause as he calculated, the quiet competence that filled the spaces where other men might have filled them with noise. "Storm's coming," Clara said, still watching the sky. A real one by the look of it. James glanced toward the window. "We'll be fine. I've weathered worse." Something in his tone made her turn. He was staring at the ledger, but his eyes had gone distant, focused on something years away. His hand had stilled, pencil hovering above the page. "James?" He blinked, coming back. "Sorry, old ghosts." She moved to the table and sat down across from him. In the months since she'd arrived, they'd shared meals and work and companionable silence, but they hadn't shared stories. Not really. They knew the outlines of each other's losses, the shapes of their scars, but not the details, not the moments that woke them in the night. "Tell me," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something. Then he closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. "It was December of 1864, he began, his voice low and steady. "I was at a field hospital near Petersburg. They'd taken my legs 3 days before. Gangrene from frostbite, battlefield amputation, the kind of surgery you don't expect to survive. But I did. Woke up screaming, they said. Kept screaming until the morphine hit." Clara's hands folded in her lap, but she didn't look away. "The hospital was overrun," James continued. "Hundreds of men, not enough doctors, not enough of anything. They'd put me in a corner on a cot with a dozen other amputees. We were the ones they didn't think would make it. The ones they'd stopped wasting supplies on." He paused, jaw working. "I was delirious most of the time. Fever, infection. I remember pieces, screaming, praying, begging someone to just let me die and be done with it. Outside, the snow fell harder now, thick flakes swirling in the wind. There was a woman," James said, and something in his voice changed, softened. "I don't know who she was. She wasn't a nurse, at least not officially. She wore a grey dress, plain, patched at the sleeves. Her hair was tied back under a scarf. She moved through that corner like a ghost, doing what the nurses didn't have time for. Bringing water, changing bandages, sitting with men while they died, so they wouldn't die alone." Clara's heart beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. "One night, must have been around midnight, I woke up choking, couldn't breathe, felt like I was drowning. She was there." James's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "She lifted my head, held a cup to my lips. Water with something bitter in it, willow bark maybe, something for the fever. She made me drink it all. Then she took a wet cloth and wiped the sweat off my face, my neck. She didn't say much. Just, 'You're going to live. I know you don't want to, but you're going to live, and you're going to have to decide what to do with that.'" Clara's throat felt tight. "I tried to thank her," James said. "Tried to ask her name. But she just shook her head and said, 'Names don't matter here. Only survival matters. Then she moved on to the next man. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. I saw her 3 more times after that. Always at night, always when I was at my worst. She never stayed long, never said much, but every time she came, I made it through to morning. And then one day, she was gone. I asked the doctors about her. They said they didn't know who I was talking about. Said there'd been volunteers coming and going. Women from the town helping however they could, but they didn't keep records. James reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small piece of cloth, faded and soft from years of handling. He laid it on the table between them. It was a handkerchief, plain white linen, embroidered in one corner with a single tiny bluebird, the stitching precise but humble. "She left this," he said. "I woke up one morning and it was tucked under my pillow. I kept it, carried it through every hospital, every train ride home, every day since. I told myself it was a reminder that someone had cared enough to keep me alive when I didn't care about myself." Clara stared at the handkerchief. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges. She knew that stitching. She'd learned it from her mother, who'd learned it from her grandmother, a bluebird for hope, always in the left corner, always with 7 stitches for the tail feathers. She'd sewn dozens of them over the years, given them to soldiers who had nothing, left them behind when she moved on, because carrying memories was dangerous when you had nowhere safe to keep them. James was watching her now, his gaze steady and knowing. "I didn't recognize your voice at first," he said quietly. "Not in the church. Too many years, too much noise. But that first night here, when you were humming while you cooked, that hymn, 'Come Thou Fount,' it came back to me. You used to hum it in the hospital. Late at night, when you thought no one could hear." Clara's hands trembled. She pressed them flat against the table. "And then there was the way you make tea," James continued. "Willow bark and honey, the exact way she made it. The way you fold bandages into thirds, not halves. The way you sit with the chickens when you collect eggs, like you're keeping them company instead of just doing a chore." He paused. "You don't have to confirm it. I'm not asking you to. But I know, Clara. I've known for weeks." The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I volunteered at 3 hospitals during the war. Petersburg was the last one. I wasn't trained. I wasn't supposed to be there. But they needed hands, and I had them." She looked up at him, eyes bright but tearless. "I don't remember most of the men I helped. There were too many. But I remember you." James's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "You were the one who wouldn't stop fighting," Clara said. "Even when you wanted to die, you fought. You cursed and screamed and clawed your way back every single night. I remember thinking, this one's going to make it. This one's too stubborn to quit." A faint, sad smile crossed her face. "I was right. Why didn't you say anything?" James asked. "When you saw me in the church, when you agreed to marry me, why didn't you tell me?" Clara looked down at the handkerchief, at the bluebird she'd stitched a lifetime ago. "Because that woman, the one in the hospital, she doesn't exist anymore. She died when the war ended, and there was no place left for her. I became someone else, someone smaller, someone who survived by not being remembered." She met his eyes again. "And I didn't think you'd want to be reminded of that place, of what you were." James reached across the table and gently picked up the handkerchief. He folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. "You're wrong," he said. "I think about that place every day, not because I want to, because it made me what I am. And the woman who kept me alive in that hell is the reason I'm sitting here now." He leaned forward slightly. "You don't get to decide you're someone smaller, Clara, not in this house. Not with me." She felt something break open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight for years. Not grief, not quite relief, something in between, the raw, aching space where honesty lives. "I left the hospitals when the war ended," Clara said, the words coming slowly, like drawing water from a deep well. "I went home to my father's house in Grafton. He was already sick by then, though he wouldn't admit it. I spent the next 8 years taking care of him, watching him fade, listening to him talk about my brother who died at Antietam, like he was the only child he'd ever had. When he finally passed, I thought maybe I'd be free. But all I got was his debts and a town that remembered me as the spinster daughter who never married, never mattered. She paused, her fingers tracing the grain of the table. I stopped being the woman who saved people. I became the woman who needed saving. And I hated it. Hated myself for it. James shook his head slowly. You didn't need saving, Clara. You needed a choice. There's a difference, is there? Yes, his voice was firm now, certain. Saving is something done to you. Choosing is something you do for yourself. You chose to come here. You chose to stay. That's not weakness. That's the same strength that kept me breathing in that hospital. Clara's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. Why didn't you tell me you knew? Why let me keep the secret? Because it wasn't mine to take, James said simply. You gave me something once, without asking for anything in return. I figured I owed you the same. He rested his hands on the table, palms down, steady. And because I wanted you to choose to tell me, I wanted it to be yours to give, not mine to extract. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, building drifts against the porch rail, covering the world in white. Clara stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the storm. I thought I'd left her behind, she said quietly. The woman who wasn't afraid. The woman who walked into the worst places and did what needed doing. I'd thought the war took her, or Grafton buried her, or maybe I just got too tired to keep being her. James wheeled closer, stopping beside her. Maybe you didn't leave her behind. Maybe she just needed a place where she could breathe again. Clara turned to look at him. This man who'd bought her for the price of a promise, who'd given her shelter and food and something more valuable than either, dignity, who'd recognized her not despite what she'd been. But because of it, I didn't come here to be saved, she said, echoing words she'd spoken to him in another life, in another place where survival was measured in hours instead of years. I know, James said. You came here to survive, and you're doing it. He held her gaze. But maybe we could do more than just survive. Maybe we could build something, not out of obligation, not out of desperation, but because we choose to. Clara felt the tears come then, silent and unstoppable. Not tears of sadness, but of something breaking loose. Years of holding still, holding silent, holding small. James didn't try to comfort her. He just sat beside her and let her cry, the same way she'd once sat beside him and let him fight. When the tears finally stopped, Clara wiped her face with her sleeve and took a shaky breath. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. Build something. I only know how to patch things together and hope they hold. Then we'll figure it out together, James said. Same way we've figured out everything else. That night, after they'd eaten supper and banked the fire, Clara stood at the door to her room and looked back at James, who was settling into his bed across the room. The handkerchief with the bluebird sat on the table between them, no longer a secret, no longer a weight. Thank you, she said. For what? For letting me be her again. James smiled, small and true. She never left. You just forgot where to look. Clara closed the door to her room, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel separated. She felt held, not by walls, not by obligation, but by the simple, sturdy truth that some bonds are forged in the hardest places and tested by the hardest years. And when they hold, when they truly hold, they become unbreakable. Outside, the storm raged through the night. Inside, two people who'd saved each other without knowing it slept peacefully. The weight of secrets finally lifted, the possibility of something new finally taking root. Winter deepened. The snow that had fallen in November stayed, packed down into hard layers that crunched underfoot and turned the world into something carved from marble and shadow. December arrived with shorter days and longer nights, the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned water to ice in the bucket between morning and noon. Clara moved through the cabin with increasing confidence. No longer a guest navigating unfamiliar territory, but a woman who knew where every pot hung, which floorboard creaked, how to bank the fire so it would last until dawn. She'd begun rearranging small things, moving the dish towels closer to the basin, relocating the coffee tin to a lower shelf where she could reach it without stretching. James noticed but said nothing, and his silence was permission. One morning, Clara stood at the window watching a cardinal perched on the porch rail, brilliant red against white snow, and realized she hadn't thought about Grafton in days, hadn't thought about the relief committee, the charity room, the careful invisibility she'd practiced like a craft. This cabin had become real, and her old life had become the dream, distant, faded, belonging to someone else. "We need supplies," James said from behind her, his voice cutting through her reverie. "Sugar, salt, lamp oil, a few other things. I was planning to go to town today, but the road's bad. Might be better to wait until next week." Clara turned from the window. "Or I could go." James looked up from the harness he was mending. "Alone? I know the way." "The mare knows it better than I do." She kept her voice level, casual. "You need to finish the runner for the sled. I can manage the trading post." He studied her for a long moment, not with doubt, but with consideration. "You sure you want to go back there?" "I'm not going back," Clara said quietly. "I'm just going to town." Something shifted in his expression, recognition perhaps, or respect. He nodded once. "Take the list from the table. And take this." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather purse, heavy with coins. "That's for supplies and whatever else you need. Don't let Horace at the trading post shortchange you. He'll try." Clara took the purse, feeling its weight. It wasn't just money. It was trust. "I'll be careful. I know you will." An hour later, Clara guided the mare down the mountain road, the sled runners hissing over packed snow. She wore her wool coat, her father's old scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and gloves James had lined with rabbit fur. The forest was silent, except for the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the occasional crack of ice breaking on tree branches. She expected to feel nervous as Grafton came into view. The church steeple first, then the rooflines, then the main street with its collection of weathered buildings hunched against the cold. But what she felt instead was detachment, as if she were visiting a place she'd read about in a book, rather than one where she'd lived her entire life. The trading post sat at the north end of town, a squat building with a false front and windows fogged with condensation. Clara tied the mare to the hitching post and stepped inside. Warmth hit her immediately, along with the smell of coffee, leather, and the sweet, sour tang of pickle barrels. Horace Kimball stood behind the counter, a heavy man with small eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently fixed in a skeptical line. He looked up when the bell rang, and his expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession. Surprise, recognition, something darker that might have been judgment. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, and the name sounded strange in his mouth, like he was testing its validity. "Didn't expect to see you, Mr. Kimball." Clara pulled the list from her pocket and set it on the counter. "I need these items, please." He picked up the list, squinting at James's precise handwriting. "Sugar, salt, lamp oil, coffee, thread." He trailed off, then looked up at her with an expression that made her skin prickle. "How's married life treating you?" "Well enough. Must be quite an adjustment." "Living up there alone with a cripple." Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "My husband is capable of more than most men, with 2 working legs. Now, do you have the items or not?" Horace's mouth twitched. "Oh, I've got them. Question is whether you've got the funds. James Brennan hasn't exactly been flush since he came back from the war." Clara placed the leather purse on the counter with a solid thump. "Will this suffice?" He opened it, counted the coins, and something like disappointment crossed his face. "I suppose it will." He began gathering items from the shelves, moving with deliberate slowness, making her wait. "You know, people are talking. People always talk. They're saying you ran up there mighty quick. Desperate, some say. Others figure you had your reasons." He set a bag of sugar on the counter, harder than necessary. "Some remember why you were desperate in the first place." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she said nothing. Horace leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that wasn't quiet at all. "Some say you're lucky Brennan took you. Lucky anyone would after the Thornton business." The name hit like a slap. Clara's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain still. "To show nothing. That's enough." said a voice from behind her. Clara turned to see Anna Turner standing in the doorway, wrapped in a thick shawl, her face sharp with disapproval. She moved past Clara and faced Horace directly. "Give her the supplies, take her money, and keep your opinions to yourself." Horace's face reddened. "I'm just making conversation." "No, you're spreading poison. There's a difference." Anna's voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone who'd stopped tolerating nonsense years ago. "Now finish the order." He did grudgingly, piling the items into a crate without another word. Clara paid, took her supplies, and walked out into the cold. Anna followed. "Thank you," Clara said, loading the crate onto the sled. "Don't thank me. Just don't let men like that make you small again." Anna pulled her shawl tighter. "You look better than you did in October. Stronger." "I feel stronger." Anna nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's what marriage should do. Make you more yourself, not less." She paused, then added quietly, "What happened with Henry Thornton wasn't your fault. You know that, don't you?" Clara's hands stilled on the rope securing the crate. "Does it matter?" "Everyone believes it was." "It matters," Anna said firmly. "And not everyone believes it. Some of us know the truth. We just didn't speak loud enough when it counted." She touched Clara's arm briefly. "But that doesn't mean the truth stopped being true." Clara looked at her. This woman who'd kept her distance in town, but who'd shown up at her wedding with yellow bells and quiet solidarity. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're not hiding anymore," Anna said simply. "And I figured it was time someone said out loud what should have been said years ago. You deserved better than what this town gave you." The words settled into Clara like warmth after frostbite. Painful, necessary, healing. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Anna smiled. "You should come to dinner sometime. You and James both. My husband would like to meet him." She turned to go, then looked back. "And Clara, don't let the past keep you from the future. That's what they want. Don't give it to them." Clara drove back to the cabin with Anna's words circling in her mind, like birds looking for a place to land. The past, the future, the space between them where she'd been living, neither moving forward nor falling back, just existing in a kind of suspended present. When she reached the cabin, James was on the porch, waiting. He'd heard the sled, had wheeled himself out to help unload. But when he saw her face, he stopped. What happened? "Nothing. Everything." Clara climbed down from the sled, her legs unsteady. "I need to tell you something." They brought the supplies inside first, working in silence, unpacking the crate and storing everything in its place. Then Clara sat at the table, and James positioned himself across from her, hands folded. "Waiting. You asked me once why I didn't marry before," Clara began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I told you there was no one." That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. James said nothing, just listened. "When I was 23, I was engaged," Clara continued. "His name was Henry Thornton. He was a merchant's son, educated, charming. My father approved. The whole town approved. It was a good match. Better than I had any right to expect, people said, for a woman with no dowry and only her reputation to recommend her." She paused, gathering herself. "Henry was kind at first, attentive, but after we were engaged, things changed. He became possessive, controlling. He wanted to know where I was every moment, who I spoke to, what I thought about. He said it was because he loved me, because he wanted to protect me. I believed him. I was young and stupid, and I believed him." Her voice hardened. "One night he came to my father's house after dinner. My father was visiting a neighbor. Henry said he wanted to talk about the wedding, about our future. But when I let him in, he tried to—" She stopped, swallowed. "He forced himself on me. Or tried to. I fought. I screamed. I hit him with the fireplace poker hard enough to break his nose." James's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the edge of the table. "He left bleeding, cursing, threatening," Clara continued. "And the next day, he told everyone I'd invited him in, that I'd led him on and then attacked him when he tried to do his duty as my future husband. He said I was unstable, violent, that I'd lured him into a compromising situation and then tried to destroy him when he resisted my advances." She laughed, a bitter sound. "His father was a deacon. His mother was president of the Ladies' Auxiliary. My father was a drunk with bad debts and a dead wife. Who do you think the town believed? You, James said quietly. I believe you. Clara's eyes stung, but she pushed forward. The engagement was broken. Henry told everyone I was damaged goods, that no decent man would want me now. My father believed him, or at least he didn't defend me. He said I must have done something to encourage it, that women like me always did. Her voice cracked slightly. I became invisible after that. The spinster who'd ruined her one chance. The woman who'd been too proud, too forward, too much of something she shouldn't have been. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses earned from years of work, from surviving. So when you asked why I agreed to marry you, why I was desperate enough to trade my life for food and shelter, it wasn't just poverty. It was because I'd spent 8 years being treated like I was worthless, like I was guilty of something I didn't do. And when you looked at me on that platform and said you were marrying a person, not a face, her voice broke. You were the first person in 8 years to treat me like I was human. The silence that followed was complete. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then James spoke. Where is he now? Henry Thornton. He married a banker's daughter 2 years later. They live in Philadelphia. He's respectable, successful, everything he wanted to be. Clara's voice was flat. And I was the scandal he left behind. James wheeled back from the table, turning toward the fire. For a long moment he said nothing, and Clara felt panic rising in her chest. She'd told him. She'd revealed the ugly truth that made her unmarriageable, the stain that had followed her for years. And now he knew what he'd bought for $1 and a promise, a woman ruined by another man's lies. But when James turned back, his face wasn't disgusted or disappointed. It was furious. That man should be in prison, he said, his voice low and hard. And every person who believed him, every person who turned away from you, they should be ashamed. But they won't be, because men like that don't face consequences, and towns like this don't question their own. Clara stared at him. You don't think I think you survived something that would have broken most people, James interrupted. I think you lived for 8 years in a place that punished you for being attacked. And I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I'm honored that you chose to tell me. The words hit Clara like a wave, washing away years of shame and silence and self-doubt. She'd expected judgment. She'd prepared for rejection, but James was offering something she'd stopped believing existed. Unconditional acceptance. I should have told you before, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before we married. You had a right to know. You had a right to keep it private until you were ready to share it, James countered. Your past is yours, Clara, not mine to demand, not anyone's to judge. She looked at him, this man who'd been broken by war and rebuilt himself with quiet determination, who'd recognized her when she'd forgotten herself, who'd given her space to remember who she was. How did you get to be this way? She asked. So certain. So fair, James smiled, sad and knowing. I spent 2 years in hospitals, being treated like I wasn't fully human anymore. Like losing my legs meant I'd lost my mind, my dignity, my worth. I learned real quick that the world's full of people who'll decide what you're worth based on what they can see, not who you are. He held her gaze. I swore if I ever got the chance to see someone truly, to judge them by their character and not their circumstances, I'd take it. You gave me that chance in a hospital in Virginia. I'm returning the favor. Clara felt tears spill over, hot against her cold cheeks. But they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally being seen by someone who mattered. I'm tired of being ashamed, she said. Tired of carrying something that was never mine to carry. Then put it down, James said simply. Right here. Right now. Leave it behind. Clara stood and walked to the fire. She stared into the flames, thinking about Henry Thornton, about the town that had judged her, about the years she'd spent making herself small enough to slip through the cracks of other people's contempt. She thought about the woman she'd been in that hospital. Fearless, purposeful, necessary. And she thought about the woman she was becoming here, not fearless, but brave enough to choose her own life. She turned back to James. "I want to go to dinner at Anna Turner's house. With you. I want to walk into town and hold my head up. I want to stop hiding." James nodded slowly. "Then we will, even though people will talk. Even though they'll say things about both of us. Let them talk," James said. "We've survived worse than gossip." That night, they sat by the fire longer than usual, not speaking much, just existing in the same space with the weight of secrets finally lifted. Clara had told her truth. James had accepted it, and in that acceptance, something fundamental had shifted between them, from arrangement to alliance, from survival to partnership. Before she went to bed, Clara paused at James's chair. He looked up, and she bent down and kissed his forehead, gentle and deliberate. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied. In her room, Clara lay in the darkness and felt lighter than she had in years. The shame was still there, shame that deep doesn't disappear in a single conversation, but it no longer defined her. She'd spoken it aloud to someone who mattered, and he hadn't flinched, hadn't turned away, hadn't decided she was less because of what had been done to her. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a sound like breathing. Inside, Clara Brennan, no longer Whitmore, no longer the ruined spinster, but something new entirely, closed her eyes and slept. And for the first time in 8 years, she didn't dream of running. The week before Christmas, the world turned crystalline. Ice-coated every branch, every blade of dead grass, every surface until the forest looked like something carved from glass. The sun, when it appeared, transformed everything into prisms of light, dazzling, cold, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with endurance. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, watching James work. He'd rigged a pulley system from the rafters, allowing him to lift hay bales from the loft without needing to climb. Now he was adjusting the rope tension, his hands moving with the precision of someone who'd learned to engineer solutions to problems other men never had to consider. She'd offered to help, but he'd waved her off, not dismissively, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. She returned to the cabin and began preparing their midday meal. Potatoes from the cellar, salt pork from the barrel, dried onions that had been hanging from the rafters since autumn. Simple food, but honest. The kind that filled the belly and reminded you that survival was its own kind of victory. While the stew simmered, Clara moved to the wooden chest beneath the window. Her chest now, though she still thought of it as communal space. Inside were her few possessions. The grey wool dress she'd worn to town, a spare shift, stockings she'd done so many times, the original fabric was barely visible, and a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. She'd been carrying it since Grafton, never opening it, never quite ready to look at what it contained. It was the last thing she'd taken from her father's house before it was sold, a single photograph in a tarnished frame. Her mother, young and smiling, holding an infant Clara. The only proof that she'd once belonged to someone who'd looked at her with uncomplicated love. Clara unwrapped it now, holding the photograph carefully. The image was faded, the edges worn, but her mother's face was still clear. Strong cheekbones, dark hair pulled back, eyes that held both kindness and steel. Clara studied it, searching for resemblance, for connection, for some evidence that the woman in the picture and the woman holding it were part of the same story. The door opened, bringing cold air and the sound of wheels on wood. James entered, brushing ice from his shoulders. He glanced at her, then at the photograph in her hands. "Your mother?" "Yes." Clara set the frame on the table gently. "She died when I was 12. Fever took her in 3 days. One moment she was hanging laundry, the next she was gone." James wheeled closer, studying the photograph. "You have her eyes. My father used to say I had her stubbornness." Clara traced the frame's edge with one finger. "He never forgave either of us for it." "Stubbornness keeps people alive," James said. "Your father should have been grateful." Clara smiled faintly. He wasn't the grateful type. She picked up the frame again, turning it over in her hands. I've been carrying this for months, but I never had anywhere to put it. Nowhere that felt like mine. James was quiet for a moment, then said, "Wait here." He disappeared into the back storage room, the one Clara rarely entered because it seemed private, filled with things that predated her arrival. She heard the sound of wood scraping on wood, boxes being moved, the creak of old hinges. Then he emerged carrying a small wooden box, plain but well made, about the size of a bread loaf. He set it on the table beside the photograph. "This belonged to Rebecca," he said. "She kept letters in it, small things she wanted to remember. After she died, I packed it away because I couldn't look at it, but I think she'd want it used." Clara looked at the box, then at James. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He pushed it toward her. "You need a place for your memories. This is as good as any." Clara opened the box carefully. Inside were letters tied with ribbon, a pressed flower, a small wooden bird carved with careful hands. Evidence of a life lived and lost. She touched nothing, just looked, honoring what had been before adding what would be. "Thank you," she said quietly. James nodded, then wheeled to the stove and ladled stew into 2 bowls. They ate in comfortable silence, the photograph still sitting between them, like a bridge between past and present. After lunch, James returned to the barn, and Clara spent the afternoon organizing her few possessions in Rebecca's box. The photograph went in first, carefully wrapped in cloth. Then her mother's recipe for apple butter, written in fading ink on yellowed paper. A button from her brother's uniform, sent home after Antietam. Small things, but they were hers, and now they had a home. She was closing the box when James called from the other room. "Clara, can you come here?" She found him in his sleeping area, positioned beside a tall wardrobe she'd never seen him open. The doors were ajar now, revealing clothes that had hung untouched for years. "Rebecca was about your height," James said, not looking at her. "Maybe a bit smaller, but close enough. These have been sitting here doing nothing. Seems wasteful." Clara stepped closer and saw what he meant. Dresses, 3 of them, hanging in careful rows. One was deep green wool, practical and warm. Another was cotton printed with tiny flowers, faded but still lovely. The third was dark blue, simple but elegant, with buttons made from polished horn. "James, I can't." "Why not?" He turned to face her. "They're no good to anyone else, and you need more than one dress. Winter's hard on fabric." Clara reached out and touched the green wool, feeling its weight, its quality. It was far finer than anything she'd owned in years. This was hers. It was. Now it could be yours. His voice was gentle but firm. Rebecca would have wanted them worn, not buried in a wardrobe. She was practical that way, hated waste. Clara pulled the green dress from its hanger and held it against herself. It was slightly long, but nothing that couldn't be hemmed. The wool was thick and well woven, the kind that would keep out the worst of the cold. "Try it on," James said. "See if it fits." She carried it to her room and changed slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons. The dress fit remarkably well. A bit loose in the waist, a bit long in the hem, but nothing that suggested it belonged to someone else. When she looked down at herself, she saw not a borrowed dress, but a new possibility. She emerged from the room. James looked up and went still. "It suits you," he said finally. "The color." Clara smoothed the fabric self-consciously. "I can hem it. Take in the waist. Or leave it as is and let yourself grow into it." James wheeled closer. "You're eating better now. Working hard. Give it time." She understood what he wasn't saying, that she'd been half-starved when she arrived, thin from deprivation and stress, and that the months here had begun to restore what Grafton had slowly taken away. "There's something else," James said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. Clara took it, feeling its weight, its contours. She unwrapped it carefully and found a hand mirror, oval, with a simple wooden frame. The glass was old but clear, the silvering intact. "It was my mother's," James said. "She gave it to Rebecca when we married, said every woman needed to be able to see herself clearly." He paused. "I think you need that more than anyone." Clara stared at the mirror in her hands. She hadn't looked at herself, truly looked, in months. The mirror in Grafton's church had been high and cracked, more useful for judging the straightness of a hat than for seeing one's face. And in the weeks before she'd left, she'd avoided mirrors entirely, afraid of what she'd see. The woman everyone said she was, instead of the woman she'd been. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "Then wait until you are," James said, "but keep it close, for when you need it." That night, Clara sat on her cot with the mirror in her lap, still wrapped. The lamp burned low, casting soft shadows across the walls. Outside, wind moved through the ice-covered trees, creating sounds like distant bells. She thought about the woman she'd been at 23, engaged, hopeful, naive enough to believe that kindness was the natural state of things. She thought about the woman she'd become in the years after, careful, invisible, convinced that survival meant making herself small enough to be overlooked. And she thought about the woman she was becoming here, neither the naive girl nor the invisible ghost, but something new, something built from honesty and work, and the radical act of being seen by someone who refused to look away. Clara unwrapped the mirror. Her face looked back at her, thinner than she remembered, older with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before the war. Her hair was loose, dark with threads of early grey. Her skin was pale from winter, but healthy, no longer the sallow colour of chronic hunger. She looked like her mother, not the young woman in the photograph, but the woman Clara remembered from those last years. Strong, weathered, capable. Someone who'd survived and continued surviving because giving up wasn't an option she'd been willing to consider. Clara studied herself for a long moment, then spoke aloud to her reflection. "You're not what he said you were. You never were." The words felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar, but true in a way that settled deep in her bones. She set the mirror on the small table beside her cot, propped against the wall where she could see it. Then she lay down and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow she would hem the green dress. She would wear it and feel like herself. And slowly, carefully, she would rebuild the life that had been stolen from her by lies and cruelty and her own willingness to believe what others said she was. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a rhythm of work and rest. Clara hemmed the green dress and began wearing it daily, the blue one saved for what James called town occasions, though they hadn't ventured to Grafton since her supply run. The cotton dress she hung carefully in the wardrobe, waiting for spring. She and James developed new patterns. In the mornings after breakfast, she would read aloud while he worked on small repairs, sharpening tools, oiling hinges, mending tack. She'd found a collection of books on the shelf above his bed, novels mostly, adventure stories and histories, and discovered she enjoyed the act of reading aloud, of giving voice to other people's words. James was a good listener, sometimes commenting on the story, sometimes asking her to repeat a passage, always engaged. When she stumbled over a word, he'd help without condescension. When she finished a chapter, he'd ask what she thought would happen next. It was companionship of a kind Clara had never experienced. Equal, easy, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. One afternoon, while James was checking the traps on the ridge, Clara decided to reorganize the pantry. She was deep in the work, sorting jars and sacks, when she found a wooden crate pushed to the back of the bottom shelf. It was heavy, and when she pulled it into the light, she saw it was filled with candles, dozens of them in various sizes, wrapped carefully in paper. James returned an hour later to find her sitting at the table. "Surrounded by candles, what's all this?" he asked. "I found them in the pantry." "Why do we have so many?" James wheeled closer, looking at the collection with something like surprise. Rebecca made them. It was her trade. She'd render tallow, mix it with beeswax, pour them into molds. Sold them in town for extra money. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands. After she died, I packed them away. Couldn't use them. Couldn't look at them. Clara studied the candles, each one carefully made, uniform evidence of skill and patience. Their beautiful work. She was good at it. James set the candle down. What do you want to do with them? Clara looked at the candles, then at James. Use them. Light the house. Let them serve the purpose they were made for. That evening, they lit candles throughout the cabin, on the table, on the shelf above the hearth, in the window. The space transformed, becoming warmer, softer, filled with golden light that pushed back the winter darkness. Clara and James sat at the table playing chess, the board between them illuminated by Rebecca's work. And it felt less like honoring a ghost and more like continuing a legacy. She would have liked you, James said suddenly, studying the board. Rebecca. She was practical like you. Didn't suffer fools. Believed in doing what needed doing without complaint. Clara moved her knight, considering her next words carefully. Do you still miss her? Every day. James captured her bishop. But it's different now. Less like drowning, more like carrying something heavy that you've gotten used to. You learn to walk with it. Is that what you're doing with me? Learning to walk with something new? James looked up from the board, his expression serious. No, with you I'm not carrying anything. I'm building something. There's a difference. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, not from the candles, but from something deeper. So am I. They played 3 more games that night, Clara winning 2 and James winning 1. And when they finally put the pieces away, the candles had burned down to stubs. Clara gathered them carefully, saving the wax for remelting, and James banked the fire. Before she went to bed, Clara paused at the mirror on her table. She looked at herself in the candlelight, face relaxed, eyes bright, wearing a dress that fit and suited her. She looked like someone who belonged, someone who'd found her place. Good night. Clara, James called from the other room. Good night. James. She blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the cabin settle, to the wind outside, to the quiet sounds of shared life. She thought about the gifts James had given her. The box for memories, the dresses that made her feel human, the mirror that let her see herself truly, not charity, not pity, but tools for rebuilding, and she realized that she'd been wrong about what she'd agreed to in that church hall. She hadn't traded her life for survival. She'd chosen partnership, chosen the slow, difficult work of becoming whole again. Outside, the ice-covered trees caught moonlight and held it, transforming the forest into something magical. Inside, Clara Brennan, no longer invisible, no longer ashamed, closed her eyes and dreamed not of running or hiding, but of spring planting, of summer gardens, of a future she was finally brave enough to imagine. She dreamed of home. January arrived with a bitter cold that made the previous week seem mild by comparison. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the bucket within minutes of being drawn from the well. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning day and night. Clara and James moved through their routines with the careful efficiency of people conserving energy, knowing that winter this deep demanded respect. It was a Thursday morning when the first sign of trouble appeared. Clara was feeding the chickens in the barn when she noticed the mare acting strangely, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring, stamping nervously in her stall. Clara set down the feed bucket and moved closer, speaking softly, trying to calm her. The horse had always been gentle, steady, not prone to spooking. What's wrong, girl? Clara reached out to stroke the mare's neck, but the animal shied away, pressing against the far wall of the stall. That's when she heard it, the distant sound of hooves on frozen ground. Coming up the mountain road. Clara's heart jumped. They weren't expecting visitors. No one came up the ridge in January unless they had pressing business or ill intent. She moved to the barn door and peered out, shielding her eyes against the glare of sun on snow. A single rider emerged from the tree line, mounted on a black gelding, moving with the careful pace of someone unfamiliar with mountain trails. The man wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Even from a distance, there was something purposeful about his posture, something that made Clara's instincts flare with warning. She backed into the barn, moving quickly to the cabin. James was at the table cleaning his rifle, routine maintenance he performed weekly. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down the cleaning rod immediately. "Ryder coming?" Clara said, her voice tight. "I don't recognize him." James wheeled to the window and looked out. The rider was closer now, visible in the clearing. James watched for a long moment, then turned to Clara. "Get inside. Lock the door if I tell you to. Who is it?" "Don't know yet. But nobody comes up here in this cold unless they want something specific." The rider reached the edge of the yard and dismounted, tying his horse to the porch rail. He was tall, clean-shaven, probably in his mid-30s. His clothes were too fine for a mountain visit: wool coat, leather gloves, polished boots. Town clothes. Rich man's clothes. James opened the door before the man could knock, positioning himself in the doorway, blocking entry.
"Help you?"
The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair slicked back with pomade. "Mr. Brennan, I presume? My name is Victor Thornton. I believe you're married to a woman named Clara Whitmore." Clara, standing behind James, felt the blood drain from her face. Thornton, Henry's younger brother. She'd only met him once, years ago, at a church social. He'd been 15 then, arrogant even as a boy, echoing his older brother's casual cruelty. James's voice was cold. "Clara Brennan. And yes, she's my wife. What business is that of yours?" Victor's smile was thin, practiced. "May I come in? It's rather cold for a conversation conducted through a doorway. Say what you need to say from where you stand." Victor's smile faded. "Very well. I'm here on behalf of my brother Henry. Perhaps Mrs. Brennan mentioned him." "She mentioned him," James said flatly. "What does he want?" "He wants restitution." Victor pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Brennan, damaged my brother's reputation 8 years ago with false accusations. She spread lies about his character, drove him from Grafton, forced him to rebuild his life elsewhere. My brother is now in a position to seek legal remedy for the harm done to him." Clara stepped forward, despite James's warning hand. "Legal remedy for what?" "For the truth." Victor's eyes found her, and something cold flickered in them. "The truth, Miss Whitmore, is what the courts decide. And my brother has witnesses prepared to testify that you propositioned him, that you invited him to your father's house with the explicit purpose of seduction, and that when he refused your advances, you attacked him in a fit of hysteria." "That's a lie," Clara said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. "Every word of it, perhaps. But my brother has affidavits from 3 respected citizens of Grafton, attesting to your loose character, your inappropriate behavior with men, your history of emotional instability." Victor unfolded the paper. "He's prepared to file charges: assault, defamation, criminal mischief. Unless, of course, you're willing to settle the matter privately." James's hands tightened on his wheels. "What kind of settlement?" "A formal written apology published in the Grafton Gazette and the Philadelphia Inquirer, admitting that she lied about my brother and recanting all accusations, plus financial compensation for damages to his reputation. Say $2,000. The number hung in the air like a noose. $2,000 was more than most men earned in 5 years. It was impossible, and Victor knew it. "And if we refuse?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then my brother will pursue criminal charges. Mrs. Brennan will be arrested, tried, and likely convicted based on the testimony of multiple upstanding witnesses against the word of a known spinster with a history of causing trouble." Victor's smile returned. "She'll go to prison, Mr. Brennan, for years, and you'll be left alone up here with no one to help you." The threat was clear, calculated, designed to exploit every vulnerability. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and sharp. This was Henry's revenge. Not satisfied with destroying her life once, he wanted to do it again, more thoroughly, more publicly, But before she could speak, James said, "Get off my property." Victor raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me. Get on your horse and leave. Now, Mr. Brennan, I don't think you understand the seriousness. I understand that you came to my home with lies and threats, trying to extort money we don't have over crimes that were never committed." James's voice was steel. "And I'm telling you to leave before I fetch my rifle and make you leave." Victor's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. My brother has connections, resources, lawyers. You're a cripple living on a mountain with a ruined woman. You can't win this." "Maybe not," James said. "But I can make sure you don't win it either. Now get out." Victor stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Clara. "You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, the charges will be filed, and there won't be any more opportunities for settlement." He put his hat back on and moved toward his horse. Before mounting, he looked back. "My brother never forgets a slight, Mrs. Brennan, never, and he's very patient." He rode away, disappearing into the trees. James closed the door and turned to Clara. She was shaking, her hands clenched into fists, tears of rage streaming down her face. "He's going to destroy me," she said. "Everything I've built here, everything I've become, he's going to take it all away." "No," James said firmly. "He's not. You don't understand. Henry has money, influence. If he brings charges, they'll believe him. They always believe men like him." Her voice broke. "I'll lose everything. I'll lose you. I'll lose this." James wheeled forward and took her hands in his. "Listen to me. We're not giving him anything. Not an apology, not money, not your dignity. Do you understand? But how do we fight him?" "We have nothing. We have the truth," James interrupted. "And we have each other. That's more than he has." Clara wanted to believe him, but fear was a living thing inside her chest, squeezing, making it hard to breathe. She'd spent 8 years being crushed by Henry's lies. The thought of going through it again, of having her life examined and judged and destroyed in public, it was unbearable. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her cot, staring at the ceiling, mind racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Prison, trial, public humiliation, the loss of everything she'd found here, everyone who'd begun to see her as human rather than scandal. She rose before dawn and found James already awake, sitting at the table with paper and pencil, writing. He looked up when she entered. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how to handle this." Clara sat down across from him. "There's no handling it. He has the law, the money, the witnesses. We have nothing. We have Anna Turner." Clara blinked. "What?" "Anna Turner. She was at your father's house the night it happened, wasn't she? You said there was a shadow, a woman in the kitchen. That was her." Clara's mind raced back. "The dinner party. Her father is entertaining neighbors. Anna had been there with her husband, helping serve because her father's housekeeper was ill. And Anna had been in the kitchen when Henry had followed Clara inside. When She saw," Clara whispered. "She must have seen something. Then she's a witness," James said. "The one witness who can contradict Henry's lies." But she never spoke up. Not 8 years ago, not since. Why would she speak up now? Because 8 years ago, she didn't know if anyone would believe her. Now she knows someone will. Me. James leaned forward. "We need to go to her. Today, before Victor can get to her, before Henry's lawyers can intimidate her into silence." Clara felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Fragile, but real. And if she refuses? If she's too afraid? "Then we find another way," James said simply. "But we try this first." They set out 2 hours later, the sled loaded with supplies as cover for the journey. The trip to Grafton took longer than usual. The roads icy and treacherous, but the mare was sure-footed, and James drove with steady confidence. Anna Turner's house sat on the east side of town, a modest farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney. When Clara knocked, Anna opened the door herself, surprise flickering across her face. "Clara." "James." She looked between them. "What's wrong?" "We need to talk to you," Clara said. "About something that happened 8 years ago." Anna's expression shifted, understanding, then something like resignation. She stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in." They sat in Anna's small parlour, Clara and James on one side, Anna on the other. Her husband was in town at the mill, she explained. They were alone. "Victor Thornton came to our cabin yesterday," James began, making threats on behalf of his brother. "He claims Clara assaulted and defamed Henry 8 years ago. He's threatening criminal charges unless we pay restitution and issue a public apology." Anna's face went pale. That's not what happened." "I know," Clara said, "but we need someone else to know it too. Someone who was there." Anna looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "I've carried this for 8 years," she said quietly. "Knowing what I saw, knowing I said nothing. It's haunted me." "What did you see?" James asked gently. Anna took a deep breath. "I was in the kitchen that night, cleaning dishes after dinner. I heard voices in the front room, Clara and Henry. At first it sounded like normal conversation. Then Henry's voice changed, got harder, demanding. Clara said no, clear as day. She said, 'No, Henry, you need to leave.'" Clara's hands trembled. She'd forgotten Anna could have heard that, had blocked out everything except the violence that followed. "Then I heard struggling," Anna continued. "Fabric tearing. Clara screaming. I ran to the doorway and saw—" She stopped, swallowed. "I saw Henry on top of Clara. She was fighting him. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace and hit him. He fell back, bleeding, cursing. He saw me standing there. What did he do?" James asked. "He threatened me. Said if I spoke a word of what I'd seen, he'd make sure my husband lost his job at the mill, that we'd be run out of town. He said no one would believe me anyway, that his family had too much influence." Anna's voice shook. "I was a coward. I stayed silent, and I've regretted it every day since." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes. "You were protecting your family. I don't blame you. I blame myself," Anna said. She looked at James. "What do you need from me?" "A sworn statement," James said. "Written testimony of what you saw, dated and signed. Something we can present to the sheriff, to a judge if necessary. Something that proves Clara's telling the truth." Anna stood immediately. "I'll write it now." She spent the next hour at her kitchen table, writing carefully, detailing everything she'd seen and heard. When she finished, she read it aloud to Clara and James, then signed it at the bottom. James witnessed her signature, adding his own name and the date. "This might not be enough," Anna warned. "Henry's family has money, connections. They'll fight this, but it's something," James said. "It's proof that Clara's not lying, that there was a witness who saw what really happened." They left Anna's house with the statement folded carefully in James's coat pocket. On the way out of town, they stopped at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dawson was a lean man in his 50s, weathered and practical, who'd seen enough of life to be skeptical of easy answers. James laid out the situation, Victor's visit, the threats, Anna's statement. The sheriff read the document slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is a serious accusation against a prominent family," he said finally. "The accusations against my wife are serious too," James countered. "And they're false. We have a witness statement proving it." Dawson rubbed his jaw. "Victor Thornton told me he'd be filing charges by week's end. Said his brother had multiple witnesses. Paid witnesses, most likely," James said. "Anna Turner has nothing to gain from lying. She's risking her reputation to tell the truth." The sheriff looked at Clara, studying her face. "You've been quiet, Mrs. Brennan." Clara met his eyes steadily. "I have nothing to add to what Anna wrote. It's the truth, all of it. Henry Thornton assaulted me, and when I defended myself, he spent 8 years making sure everyone believed I was the villain in my own story." Her voice was strong, certain. "I'm tired of being silent about it." Dawson nodded slowly. "I'll hold on to this statement, and I'll make sure that if charges are filed, the judge sees it before any trial proceeds." He paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Brennan, I never thought much of the Thornton brothers. Too polished. Men that are smooth usually have something to hide." It wasn't a declaration of belief, but it was something. They left the office and began the journey home. The winter sun already sinking toward the horizon. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Clara asked as they climbed back into the hills. "I don't know," James admitted. "But we've done what we can. The rest is up to Henry, whether he's willing to risk his lies being exposed in open court." That evening, they received their answer. A rider came to the cabin just after dark, not Victor this time, but a courier from Grafton carrying a sealed letter. James opened it and read aloud. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, after careful consideration, my client Henry Thornton has decided not to pursue legal action at this time. He feels that sufficient time has passed and that further conflict would serve no useful purpose. He wishes you both well. Signed, Marcus Pemberton, attorney at law. Clara stared at the letter. That's it? He's just giving up? He's retreating, James said, a grim smile on his face. Anna's statement scared him. He knows if this goes to court, if she testifies, his reputation crumbles. Better to back away quietly than risk exposure. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, not quite relief, not quite triumph, but something between them. He's not coming back? Not for this, James said. Men like Henry only fight battles they know they can win. You called his bluff, Clara, and he folded. That night, Clara stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered forest, the letter still in her hand. She thought about the woman she'd been 8 years ago, terrified, silenced, convinced that speaking up would only make things worse. And she thought about the woman she was now, who'd walked into the sheriff's office and told her truth without apology, without shame. James, she said without turning around. Yes, thank you for believing me, for fighting with me instead of for me. She heard his wheels on the floor, felt him come closer. You didn't need me to fight for you, Clara. You needed someone to stand beside you while you fought for yourself. That's different. She turned and looked at him, this man who'd given her shelter and dignity and partnership, who'd seen her not as broken or ruined, but as strong enough to reclaim what had been stolen. What Henry tried to take from me, Clara said slowly, he doesn't have power over anymore. Not because he gave up, but because I stopped letting him define who I am, James smiled. Exactly. Clara folded the letter and placed it on the stove, watching it catch fire and burn to ash. The threat was gone. The past was finally truly past, and the future, their future, stretched out before them like unmarked snow, waiting for them to decide what path to make through. It together. This is all. Die Setanstakesiken. February came, with unexpected warmth, a false spring that melted the top layer of snow and sent water running in rivulets down the mountain. The trees dripped steadily, a constant percussion that sounded like the forest was waking up. It wouldn't last, James warned. True winter would return before March, but for now the world softened. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching chickadees flit between the branches, their calls bright against the grey sky. Behind her, James was reading by the fire, a book of poetry Clara had found on the shelf, and insisted he try. She could hear him occasionally chuckle or hum in appreciation, the sounds of someone discovering something new. She'd been thinking about their marriage, not regretting it, never that, but examining it the way one might examine a house's foundation before building something permanent on top of it. They'd been legally married for 4 months now, bound by necessity and witnessed by reluctant men in a church office that smelled of old hymnals and administrative dust. There had been no celebration, no declaration of intent beyond survival. Just names in a ledger and a promise to endure, but they'd become something more than that transaction. Somewhere between the chess games and shared meals, between the revelations and the fight against Henry's threats, they'd built something real, something chosen rather than desperate. Clara turned from the doorway and found James watching her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, setting down the book. "Our wedding," she said honestly. "Or what passed for one." James's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful. "Wasn't much of a ceremony, was it?" "It was what we needed at the time." Clara moved to the table and sat down across from him. "But I've been thinking, we're not those same people anymore. We're not desperate strangers making a bargain. We're—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Partners," James supplied. "Friends. Maybe more." Clara met his eyes. "Definitely more." The silence that followed was charged, full of unspoken understanding. They'd been moving toward this moment for weeks, maybe longer. Small touches that lingered, glances that meant something. The comfortable intimacy of people who'd stopped keeping walls between them. "I want to marry you again," Clara said suddenly. "Properly, with intention. Not because I need shelter or you need help, but because I choose you. Because you chose me when no one else would, and you kept choosing me every day after." James's hands stilled on the book. "A renewal of vows." "A real wedding," Clara clarified. "The one we deserved but couldn't have. Small, honest, with people who actually care about us. Not a transaction. A celebration." James wheeled closer, reaching across the table to take her hand. "When?" "March," Clara said. "When the real spring comes. When the world is coming back to life." She squeezed his hand. "If you want to." "Clara, I've wanted to marry you, really marry you, since that night you told me about Henry. Since you trusted me with the truth of who you are." His voice was rough with emotion. "Yes, absolutely yes." That afternoon they began planning. Not a large affair, neither of them wanted that, but something meaningful. They would hold it at the cabin, invite Anna Turner and her husband, Sheriff Dawson, if he'd come, maybe the pastor from Grafton and his wife. People who'd shown them kindness, who'd stood witness to their truth. "What will you wear?" James asked as they made their list. Clara thought about the dresses hanging in the wardrobe. Rebecca's dresses, beautiful and practical, but not hers. Not in the way that mattered for this moment. Then she thought about the grey wool dress folded at the bottom of her trunk. The dress she'd worn to the church hall when she'd agreed to marry a stranger. The dress that represented every hard year, every moment of invisibility, every time she'd made herself small to survive. "I'm going to make something new," Clara said slowly. "From something old." Over the next 3 weeks, Clara worked on the dress in stolen moments, early mornings before James woke, late evenings after he'd gone to bed. She took apart the grey wool, separating seams carefully, preserving every piece of usable fabric. The material had been plain, drab, the colour of ash and resignation. But wool took dye well if you knew what you were doing. Clara remembered her mother's lessons about natural dyes. She gathered what she could find: dried berries she'd stored from autumn, bark from the cherry tree behind the barn, rust from old nails dissolved in vinegar. She boiled and steeped and tested, creating colours that surprised her: soft rose from the berries, warm cream from the cherry bark, pale gold from the rust and vinegar mixture. She dyed the wool in sections, creating gradients of colour that moved from cream at the bodice to rose at the hem, with threads of gold woven throughout. It wasn't traditional. It wasn't what any bride in Grafton would wear, but it was honest. A dress that acknowledged what she'd been while celebrating what she was becoming. James knew she was working on something, but didn't ask to see it. He had his own project, building an arbour from pine branches and grapevines, something to stand under during the ceremony. He worked on it in the clearing, positioning it where the sun would hit in late afternoon. Where the forest opened up to show the valley below, Anna came to visit in mid-February, bringing fabric scraps and ribbons she'd collected. When Clara showed her the dress in progress, Anna's eyes widened. "Clara, this is beautiful. You did this yourself?" "My mother taught me," Clara said, running her fingers over the dyed wool. She said a woman who could transform what she had into what she needed would never be helpless. Anna picked up a section of rose-colored fabric, examining the dye work. "Your mother was right." She looked at Clara. "She'd be proud of you. What you've become. What you've built here." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. "I hope so. I know so," Anna said firmly. She set down the fabric and pulled something from her basket, a length of white lace, delicate and old. "This was my grandmother's. She wore it at her wedding, and my mother wore it at hers." "I wore it too." She held it out to Clara. "I'd be honored if you'd wear it." Clara took the lace carefully. It was fine work, hand-tatted, with patterns of flowers and vines. "Anna, I can't." "You can. And you will," Anna smiled. "Every bride needs something borrowed. Consider it borrowed indefinitely." That evening, Clara incorporated the lace into the dress, using it to edge the neckline and sleeves. The contrast between the dyed wool and the pristine lace was striking. Old and new, rough and refined, struggle and grace existing together. James caught her working on it one night when he came to bank the fire. She tried to hide it, but he'd already seen. "Don't stop on my account," he said, wheeling closer. "Can I see?" Clara hesitated, then held up the bodice. The colors caught the firelight, shifting and glowing. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's not finished yet. I'm not talking about the dress." Clara looked at him and understood. He wasn't seeing fabric and dye. He was seeing transformation, reclamation. The act of taking something that represented pain and turning it into something that represented choice. She set down the dress and moved to him, kneeling so they were eye level. "I love you," she said. The words came easier than she'd expected, simple and true. "I don't know when it started, but somewhere between the stew and the chess games and the fights against ghosts, I fell in love with you." James cupped her face in his hands. "I loved you before I knew your name. I loved you when you were just a voice in the dark, telling me I was going to survive. I loved you when you walked forward in that church hall and chose life over resignation. I've loved you every day since." They kissed then, gentle at first, then deeper, years of loneliness and longing finally finding expression. When they pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against. "His march can't come fast enough," she whispered. Then, "We'll make it come faster," James said. The invitations went out the first week of March, hand-delivered by James and Clara together. Anna and her husband accepted immediately. Sheriff Dawson said he'd be honored to attend. The pastor, a young man named Reverend Cole, who'd replaced the older minister Clara remembered, agreed to officiate. Even the owner of the trading post, chastened perhaps by Anna's sharp words months earlier, offered to donate a case of cider for the celebration. The day before the wedding, Clara finished the dress. She stood in her room, looking at it hanging from a peg on the wall. The colors seemed to glow even in the dim light. Cream, rose, gold, white lace. It looked nothing like the grey wool dress it had been. It looked like hope made tangible. That night she and James sat by the fire, each lost in thought. "Are you nervous?" James asked. "No," Clara said. "Excited, grateful, a little overwhelmed, but not nervous." "Good, because I'm terrified," Clara looked at him in surprise. "Of what?" "Of not being enough," James admitted. "Of you waking up one day and realizing you settled for a man who can't dance with you, can't walk beside you, can't—" "Stop." Clara moved to kneel in front of him again, taking his hands. "You are enough. You've always been enough, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. You taught me that strength isn't about what you can do, it's about what you choose to do with what you have. You chose to see me, to value me, to stand with me. That's everything." James's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't deserve you." "Good thing marriage isn't about deserving then," Clara said with a small smile. "It's about choosing, and I choose you, tomorrow and every day after." The morning of the wedding arrived with crystalline clarity. The sky was impossibly blue, the air crisp but not bitter, the sun strong enough to melt the frost by mid-morning. Spring was announcing itself, tentative but real. Clara dressed slowly, carefully, in her room, while Anna helped with buttons and lacing. The dress fit perfectly, moving with her like water, the colors shifting as she moved. Anna pinned the lace veil to Clara's hair. She'd decided to wear her hair down, loose and free, the way she'd never dared to in Grafton. "You look like springtime," Anna said, stepping back to admire the full effect. "Like everything coming back to life." Clara looked at herself in the mirror, the same mirror James had given her months ago. She saw a woman transformed not by the dress, though it was beautiful, but by the journey that had brought her to this moment, strong, brave, chosen, choosing. In the main room, James was dressed in his best, a dark suit he'd had since before the war, cleaned and pressed, with a white shirt and string tie. He'd shaved carefully, combed his hair, polished the wheels of his chair until they gleamed. He looked nervous and hopeful and impossibly handsome. Their guests had arrived, 8 people in total, gathered in the clearing around the arbor James had built. Simple pine branches woven with early catkins and trailing vines. It looked like something that had grown there naturally, part of the forest rather than imposed upon it. When Clara stepped out of the cabin, James's breath caught. She walked toward him slowly, not with the mechanical movements of a transaction, but with the deliberate pace of someone savoring the moment. When she reached him, she took his hands. Reverend Cole stood beneath the arbor, young and earnest, holding a worn Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, and Clara almost laughed at the traditional words applied to such an untraditional gathering. But then the Reverend surprised her. "James and Clara have asked me to say a few words before we begin. They've already been married once, legally, properly, according to the law. But they're here today because they want to sanctify what began in necessity and has become something sacred. They want to stand before God and their community and declare not just that they are bound, but that they choose to be bound. That's the difference between a contract and a covenant." He looked at James and Clara. "The vows you speak today aren't the first you've made to each other, but they're the first you've made as whole people, standing in the fullness of who you are, without desperation or necessity clouding your choice. That makes them powerful. That makes them holy." James went first, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Clara, I vow to see you always, not just the parts that are easy to love, but all of you. I vow to stand beside you in whatever battles come, not to fight them for you, but to be your partner in fighting them. I vow to honor the strength it took for you to choose this life, and to never take for granted the gift of your trust. I vow to love you not because you need me, but because I need you. And I vow to build with you whatever life we can imagine, for as long as we're given." Clara's hands trembled, but her voice was clear. "James, I vow to choose you every day, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because you make me want to be brave. I vow to see you as you are, whole, capable, worthy, and never as less than you are. I vow to honor the man who saved my life without knowing it, and who continues to save it by refusing to let me hide. I vow to love you not because you rescued me, but because you gave me space to rescue myself. And I vow to build with you a home where neither of us has to be small to fit." Reverend Cole smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, and in the sight of God and these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife, again and forever." James pulled Clara down gently and kissed her, and the small gathering erupted in applause and cheers. Anna was crying openly. The sheriff was grinning. The pastor's wife was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. They celebrated with cider and bread and cheese, with laughter and stories and the easy warmth of people who genuinely cared about each other. Someone produced a fiddle, the trading post owner, surprisingly, and played simple tunes, while Anna and her husband danced awkwardly in the clearing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that matched Clara's dress, the guests began to leave. Each one stopped to embrace Clara and shake James's hand, to offer blessings and well wishes. When the last one had gone, James and Clara stood together beneath the arbor, watching the light fade. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked. "When you saw me on that platform, did you imagine we'd end up here?" "I imagined survival," James said honestly. "I imagined making it through the winter. But this?" He gestured at the arbor, the cabin, the life they'd built. "This is beyond imagining. This is better than anything I could have dreamed." Clara leaned down and kissed his temple. "We should go inside." "It's getting cold. In a minute." James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I made you something." Clara took the box and opened it. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a ring, simple, carved from wood, with tiny wildflowers etched around the band. It was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly made by hand, each flower distinct and careful. "I know it's not gold," James said, "but I wanted you to have something. Something that was just yours, made just for you." Clara slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "It's better than gold," she said. "Because it's from you. Because you made it thinking of me." They stayed outside a while longer, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, breathing in the cold air that promised spring was coming but wasn't quite here yet. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of shame, the desperate choice, the slow rebuilding, the fight to reclaim what had been stolen. She thought about the grey dress that had become a wedding gown, about the transaction that had become a marriage, about the stranger who had become her partner, her friend, her love. "James," she said softly. "Yes?" "Thank you for buying me." He laughed, surprised. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I mean it." Clara turned to face him. "Thank you for being foolish enough or brave enough or desperate enough to look at a woman you couldn't see and decide she was worth choosing. Thank you for giving me a place where I could remember who I was. Thank you for fighting beside me instead of for me. Thank you for this." James took her hand, the one wearing his ring. "Thank you for saying yes, for staying, for choosing this life even when it would have been easier to run. Thank you for being brave enough to love me." They went inside together as full darkness fell. The fire was burning low, and James built it up while Clara changed out of her wedding dress, hanging it carefully where she could see it. Not hidden away like something shameful, but displayed like something precious. That night they sat by the fire, Clara in her chair and James in his, closer than they'd ever sat before. They talked about plans for spring, planting a larger garden, maybe getting a milk cow, fixing the fence line on the south pasture. Ordinary plans, future plans. The kind made by people who expected to have a future together. Later, as Clara lay in her bed, though she'd begun spending more evenings with James in the main room, the boundaries between their spaces blurring, she thought about survival. Not just the act of staying alive, but the act of building a life worth staying alive for. She thought about the woman she'd been in that church hall, desperate, invisible, willing to trade her life for bread. And she thought about the woman she was now, valued, seen, loved. The transformation hadn't been magic. It had been work, choice, the daily decision to show up as herself rather than as what others expected. In the other room she could hear James moving, settling in for the night. The sounds of shared space, shared life. The sounds of home, and Clara Brennan, no longer Whitmore, no longer invisible, no longer ashamed, closed her eyes and slept peacefully, dreaming not of the past that had tried to define her, but of the future she was actively creating, because survival, she'd learned, wasn't about enduring. It was about transformation, about taking what tried to break you and using it to build something stronger. About choosing every single day what to hold on to and what to release. She'd chosen to hold on to hope, to hold on to James, to hold on to the truth of who she was beneath the lies others had told about her. And in that choosing, she'd found something more valuable than safety or shelter or even love. Though she'd found that too, she'd found herself. And that, in the end, was the greatest reclamation of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.